So I've decided that it might be a good idea to read the gospel booklet, Rebecca, the Resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's a little gospel booklet that I pass out in newspaper stands in different cities. I travel throughout the United States and set out newspaper stands with this little gospel booklet. But I'm discovering that people, they just don't want to read anything anymore. They just would rather listen to somebody speak for some reason. So I'm gonna go through this. This can be found on darylgilbertministry.com. You click on the picture of the cross, and this is part 1 of the document that opens up. There's 2 parts. One is this little booklet, part 1, and then part 2 is the true life story. That it speaks the same gospel, but it's in a very, very easy to understand and entertaining format. It's a true life story of how all of this came to pass. This little gospel booklet, part 1, is scriptures, line by line scriptures, and it goes through line by line and explains out of the New Testament and the Old Testament, and proves with much greater assurance the gospel that I preach, which is that the death and resurrection of Christ, the literal death and resurrection of Christ, has been fulfilled in a spiritual way since the time of Christ. So that's the primary message, and because Christ has fulfilled it, there's an end to it, just as he said. He said, the things concerning me have an end. And so that literal death and resurrection has been finished. It's completed. It's done. It's come to an end. And so there's a new beginning through the literal death and resurrection of Christ. That fulfillment of it is the new beginning. And it's the gospel that I preach. So I'm gonna go through here and read this to you, and then if there's anything that I can explain or expound on, then I'll do so. I'm not prepared. I don't really feel I need to be prepared. I think that if somebody would just sit down and read this, it says all it needs to say. But it can be hard to understand if you do not know the scriptures already. So if you're not already very, very familiar with the scriptures, it's probably a better idea to read part 2, and then as you maybe read a gospel, like one of the gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John in the New Testament, and get into the New Testament, this would be a good way of assuring you of the truth about Jesus Christ. So I'm just going to start reading here. It says, it is very important throughout this entire book that you don't look at the stories told in a literal sense or with a carnal or fleshly mind, as the Bible puts it, but in a spiritual sense. Before making the main point in the book, I tried to exercise the brain with many of those stories of the Bible that Paul the Apostle explains spiritually to show that this is truly the way that the original elect saw the scriptures. Okay, so Paul the Apostle wrote most of the books of the New Testament. He established Christianity and the churches for people who weren't Jews. He was very, very prominent, very, did a lot of miracles, and he went through a lot of sufferings. His story, his life story, is found in the book of Acts in the New Testament, the book of Acts. So he was appointed by God as a very high apostle, and he taught people how the Old Testament had a spiritual meaning. It was not to be interpreted in a literal sense, but it had secret, hidden, spiritual interpretation. Okay, so that's how he taught it. So I'm going to explain this. So it says, how was the gospel preached to that generation? Using examples, as I'm about to explain. The scriptures foretold of what would happen and did during the generation of Jesus. The Old Testament scriptures foretold of what would happen and did during the generation of Jesus. But the meaning of these events were hidden to the natural or carnal mind from those who only saw in the literal or physical sense. They were revealed to those who God chose to show them to through the Spirit. The things that happened in the past and are recorded in the Bible are an example of what is to come spiritually. A pattern. They aren't the actual thing, but a shadow of the real. The covenant that God justified his people under was the covenant established with a man named Abraham. Paul the Apostle in the New Testament explained this faith that Abraham had, which was written in the Old Testament before Christ even came. Okay, so I'm thinking it's better just to go ahead and read through a couple of sections and then expound on it. So if you don't understand everything that I'm reading, just stick with me. It explains itself, and I'll also go into detail. Okay. Paul the Apostle in the New Testament explained this faith that Abraham had, which was written in the Old Testament before Christ even came. So in Romans, a New Testament book, Romans chapter 4, verse 19, he writes, "And being not weak in faith, Abraham considered not his own body now dead when he was about 100 years old, neither yet the deadness of Sarah's womb. He staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief." This happened in Genesis 17. So Abraham and Sarah. Sarah is Abraham's wife. Okay, so Abraham was very, very old. So his body was now dead. He couldn't have any children. And Sarah also. Her womb was dead. She was unable to bear children. Okay, this story happens in Genesis 17. Now, Genesis 17 is an Old Testament, the first book in the Bible. So this story of Abraham and Sarah happened in Genesis 17, if you want to read that. So God had promised Abraham when he was younger that he would give him a child or a seed that he would give the land of Israel to, which is called the Promised Land. But it didn't come to pass, to the point that now it was thought to be too late because Abraham grew too old to have children. His body and his wife Sarah's womb were now dead. Yet God said that he would still do it. So he gave a command for Abraham to do, which was according to his word, that Abraham should circumcise himself and all that were his. And so even though Abraham originally doubted and laughed at that gospel told to him by God, that God could raise his body from its dead state, he circumcised himself and all that were in his house as God commanded. So in Romans 4:12, the New Testament book, Romans 4:12, because Abraham kept the law of circumcision, he said by his actions that he believed God. And because he believed, God said that he was just before him. Romans 4:21, and being fully persuaded that what God had promised he was able also to perform, therefore it was counted to him for righteousness. Okay? So this is very, very important to understand when you get into the New Testament, because Abraham received the law of circumcision, and so Abraham's seed is considered the Jews. Abraham was the first Jew. Sarah was the mother of all Jews. Abraham was promised by God that his seed would inherit Israel, which is the land of promise. Okay? And so he commanded in that Genesis 17, if you will read that, that all who were his seed should circumcise themselves. It was a commandment. Circumcision is the male cutting off a foreskin of a male. And so when he did that, he showed, if you will read Genesis 17, he showed by his actions that he believed that God would do this, even though he was too old to have kids. He believed that God could raise his body from a dead state, so to speak. Okay, so he didn't really believe in the literal or in the spiritual death and resurrection, but he believed in what was the shadow of what we believe today, that God is going to raise us from the dead. So we have that same faith, but in a spiritual way. A better example. Again, the faith that would give life was foretold in Genesis 22. So Genesis 22, long before Christ came. Copy. So anyway, again, the faith that would give life was foretold in Genesis 22, long before Christ came, when Abraham offered his only begotten son as a sacrifice to God. Okay? So, Abraham did have a child. His name was Isaac. That was the seed that God told Abraham that this child that he would give him would inherit the land of Israel. Okay, so God did what he said because Abraham believed in him. God gave him a seed, and his name was Isaac. But after he gave him this seed that he said was going to inherit this literal promised land, Israel, he told him to kill him, to offer him up as a sacrifice to him, to himself, to God. Okay, so after God had given Abraham that promised son, Isaac, he commanded Abraham to kill him. And if you think about it, So if Isaac were dead, then the only way that God could give Isaac the promised land was to raise him from the dead. But Abraham believed God could raise his son from the dead. And so he obeyed God's commandment of faith. And because Abraham believed, God swore with an oath that to him and to his seed he would give the promised land, life. James 2:22 and 23 says, "Do you see thou how faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness." Okay, so if Abraham never obeyed God and kept his commandment to offer up Isaac as a sacrifice to him, if Abraham would have just said, "Okay, God, I believe you," but he never actually did what God told him and offered Isaac up as a sacrifice, then in his works, Abraham would have been saying that he didn't really believe in God. Because if Abraham really believed that God could raise his son from the dead, then he would obey God. He would kill his son. But if he never performed that commandment, performed that act that God told him to do, by his actions he would have been saying that he did not believe in God, that God would not be able to give Isaac that promised land. So do you see, and this is a very huge difference in churches nowadays, in different denominations. A lot of denominations say that all you have to do is believe in God, and your works don't matter. But that work was his faith. So that's why in James he says, "Do you see how a man is justified by works?" And it's not necessarily that he's justified by his work, but the faith that is in that work. So now that, let me finish reading, I'm going to go on about this. So the covenant of faith was established to Abraham. And this is that covenant. That all who believed in God, as Abraham did, would be counted as his seed. Abraham believed in the resurrection of the dead. Abraham believed that God could raise his son from the dead. Okay? All who believe in God, as Abraham believed in God, are counted for his seed. It's not a literal seed, like just because you're a Jew, but the seed is those who have the same faith that Abraham did. Big difference, though, is that now that that word to Abraham has been fulfilled through Christ, which is the seed of Abraham, the son that was raised from the dead. He was the fulfillment of that promise. That now that we believe in Christ through obedience to Him, we can no longer be justified through the commandments that are written in the Old Testament law. The Old Testament is called by Paul the Apostle the law and the prophets. Okay, there are many, many Old Testament laws. We are not under that law anymore. Okay, we're justified through faith in Christ, through the faith of Christ, through believing that he raised his son from the dead, which is Jesus Christ. Okay, so we can't go out and try to commit attempted murder of our children. We are no longer justified through those works of the law, okay? But through the faith of Christ, through obedience to him, we say that we believe that he fulfilled, that God fulfilled what he spoke would happen. I'll go into that more in a bit, but you should really try to think about these things and try to understand them. The doctrine of faith and works is very, very important to understand, because it's a huge thing in the churches. Anyway, so the covenant of faith was established that all who believed in God, as Abraham did, would be counted as a seed. Okay? But now that the true commands, which are of that same faith, have been established, and the actual resurrection of the true seed has occurred, we can no longer be justified before God through killing our children. Nor do we need to keep that covenant of circumcision or the law of Moses. Nor do we receive the promise of God as the literal seed of Abraham did in the Old Testament by Moses, through conquering other countries, murdering, and burning up their land. In fact, this is denying Christ, because the covenant of faith is against such things. Galatians 2:16 says, we know that a man is not justified by the works of the law, that is, capital law, through that covenant, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. And then I put in parentheses here, it says more about this in the last few paragraphs of this booklet. Okay, so just try to understand that Abraham was justified not because he tried to kill his son, but because of the faith of that work. So in a sense, he was justified by his work, but not because of the work, but because of the faith that was in it. Because he obeyed God. He believed that God could raise his son from the dead. When we obey Christ, we say that God has fulfilled his word, that he has raised his son from the dead, that Jesus Christ was that true son and that true fulfillment of that promise to Abraham. If we don't obey Christ, we can say by our actions that we don't really believe that he is that fulfillment. We can say in our mind that we believe in God, but when we do the things that Christ says, we say that he's the one. He's that fulfillment of that word. So we believe in God in the same way that Abraham did, okay? But not in the literal sense, in a spiritual sense. Okay, so another example of this and proof of the way that, as I'm reading now, another example and proof of the way the gospel was taught would be in the story of Moses. Okay, most people know the story of Moses. Okay, Moses, gave the law, which, was a lot of like, if you read in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, it was just, sacrifices and some pretty strange things, but he delivered the Jews from Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and brought them out into the wilderness. And eventually, God gave the Jews the promised land of Israel. So that whole story of Moses was a completion, a literal completion of his promise to Abraham. So God said that Abraham's seed would inherit this land. Okay, so Abraham was the first Jew. So literally speaking, all Jews were Abraham's seed. So through Moses, God fulfilled what he said. He gave the Jews the promised land. So he fulfilled that promise that he promised to Abraham. Okay, so these Jews were under the literal fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. So it's the same faith, but it's a different generation. Okay, it's the same faith, and they were justified through their faith that God could give them the land of Israel. When they obeyed God and they went and conquered other countries in the name of God and slaughtered all their women and children and burned up all of their cities in the land of Israel, in the promised land, in the name of God, they did these things, but they were showing by these things, by keeping these commandments that God told them to do, that they believed in the promise of God to Abraham, that God could give them that literal land. Okay, so, all right, so, but Paul the Apostle explains, mainly in the book of Hebrews, the story of Moses is not to be done in a literal sense anymore, but it was a example of the true fulfillment of it as Christians. So here we go. So another example and proof of the way the gospel was taught would be in the story of Moses. It is commonly known in Christian doctrine that the promised land of Canaan in the Old Testament, now listen, is the literal example of the true and spiritual promised land, heaven and life. So in Christian doctrine, we don't look for a literal land. This is important, okay? Because a lot of people still focusing on Jerusalem and the land of Israel, and that's that God's going to do something there. Okay, that's done. It's finished. All of that and all of the works that are associated with that has ended. Okay, we don't look for that no more. We look for a spiritual